A very warm welcome, everyone, to the Maritime Education Podcast. My name's Barry Sadler, and welcome back to our regulars, and a very warm welcome to you if you're new to the podcast. The podcast itself is all about maritime affairs, but covers a broad range of subjects. So I do hope there's something for everyone in all of our podcasts that we have produced so far. Today I want to talk a little bit about the collision regulations. One of the reasons why I decided to do a collision regulation podcast is because at the moment we seem to have so many reports being published on collisions that have happened between vessels, which could really have been avoided if the collision regulations were taken into account. Some of you may have already heard my podcast on the Verity, where we talked about a collision that vessel had because both vessels that were involved, the Verity and a ship called the Polsey, did not comply with some of the more simple requirements of the collision regulations, and as a result they collided and there were fatalities. I thought it might be quite nice for me to talk a little bit first about the history of the collision regulations, because they go back quite a long time. Now, pre-actual regulations, the requirements for avoiding collisions were mainly based upon custom and tradition. Now, this was pre-1840, before an organisation called Trinity House got involved, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But pre-1840, local custom and tradition really set out how vessels avoided one another. Now, in those very, very early days of, shall we say, larger sailing vessels, so that's the 16th and 17th centuries, we relied mainly on the direction of the wind to determine who was the give way and stand on vessel. The basic rule that sailing vessels used, particularly in and around Northern Europe, the United Kingdom, and in particular the English Channel, which in the 1700s became a very, very busy waterway, the basic rule that sailing vessels used was that a ship on starboard tack, so that's wind coming over the starboard side of the ship, had the right of way over a ship on port tack, so that's the wind coming over the port side of the ship. And because of the manoeuvrability of sailing vessels, if a sailing vessel was to windward of another vessel, then it also had to give way to that vessel that was to leeward. So basically what that meant was that if a ship was upwind of another ship and its sails were full and it had a bit of speed on and it was able to control itself, it made a lot more sense for that vessel to keep out of the way of the vessel that was downwind, whose sails may have been affected by the other vessel and which may not have the kind of drive from its sails required to effectively manoeuvre the vessel using the rudder. They were very, very basic establishments of a give-way, stand-on scenario based purely on the direction of the wind. Beauty of that was that it didn't matter what direction the wind was coming from, those rules worked. And for really a few hundred years, where we were operating fairly big sailing ships within the English Channel, mainly for trade, but yes, occasionally for the various wars that happened in between the northern European countries, these rules worked quite well. Now, they obviously started to come under a lot of scrutiny when we started to introduce engines onto ships. Now, once we had an engine, we weren't reliant on the wind anymore. And so the port and starboard tack and the windward leeward principles that had worked so well between sailing vessels over the past few hundred years was no longer applicable. One of the things to remember about collision regulations, particularly in the 16 and 1700s, was that if two vessels did collide because there was some misunderstanding between the masters of both ships, it wasn't just a matter of losing money and one merchant being without his cargo, Or indeed, it wasn't just a matter about loss of life. Loss of life in the 16 and 1700s at sea was just considered to be a hazard of going to sea. If you went to sea, then there was a possibility you could be involved in a collision and lose your life. And it wasn't really until the 1900s that the safety of life at sea started to have real bite. Prior to that, the 16 and 1700s, if you were lost at sea, then the government would normally compensate your family, and it was just seen as an everyday hazard of being a seaman. It wasn't just about loss of life at sea. When vessels were colliding, particularly in the English Channel and Northern Europe, the collision and who was responsible for the collision may have been a fairly lengthy argument. It may have been an argument between the countries of whose flags those vessels were flying, and in some cases those arguments would escalate into fights, and even further sometimes, particularly if the cargo was considered to be a cargo of the crown or a very, very valuable cargo, may have ended up in a small localised war just because two ships collided with one another due to misunderstanding. By the time we get to the 1800s, that kind of, shall we say, volatility had died down somewhat, and we basically turned our attention to the fact that we were putting engines in ships and they were now not bound by the wind. Ships were also getting much bigger and much heavier, because once you've put an engine in a ship, you've got a lot more power available to you through the propeller and the rudder than you had through sails. And although sails were very, very efficient and very, very cheap to power the vessels along, they weren't able to push the vessel along at any great speed. The vessels had to be a certain size because the sails couldn't be made big enough to push huge vessels along at any real usable speed. And ultimately, once engines were in and we had a lot of horsepower going on, we were able to make bigger ships. We were also able to make the ships out of something other than wood, and ships were then created from steel, steel being a lot stronger and a lot more less likely to rot, needed less maintenance. But the thing about steel, of course, is that it was much heavier than wood, and therefore steel ships were great because of their longevity, but they started to displace a lot more. In other words, steel ships were heavier, they had a lot more momentum. Once you start putting an engine in a ship and driving that ship along, and that ship being bigger and heavier, the collisions now started to be a lot more significant. It was no longer about a small loss of cargo and a loss of life. It was now about very, very large losses of cargo, huge underwriting problems for establishments like Lloyd's of London, who were finding themselves underwriting maritime adventures only to see incredibly valuable ships with incredibly valuable cargoes on board going down because they had collided with other vessels. So steamships brought about a whole new era of the need for something to be produced in order to stop the collisions happening based on something other than the wind, because now we didn't have sails, now we had engines. Modern framework of the collision regulations basically started out in 1840. And it started out when an organisation known as Trinity House started to produce what they called the rule of the road, a colloquialism that we use even today to describe the collision regulations. The rule of the road is what we call our latest iteration, the 1972 International Convention for Preventing Collisions at Sea. Trinity House are a very, very old establishment. They originally got their royal charter from King Henry VIII way back in 1514. And they were granted a royal charter to the master wardens and assistants of the guild, fraternity, brotherhood of the most glorious, undivided Trinity and of St. Clement. was how Henry VIII granted their first royal charter. Their initial mission of the Trinity House was to regulate pilotage on the River Thames and provide charity housing for elderly or injured sailors. That's what they were initially set up to do. Now, a lot of you may know that they did take on pilotage in all the ports around the UK eventually, until the modern 1987 Pilotage Act took the pilotage, except deep sea pilotage, away from Trinity House and put it in the hands of local competent harbour authorities. But before that, Trinity House ran the pilotage service. Various crowns bestowed various acts upon Trinity House to empower them to do various things. So, for instance, in 1566, Queen Elizabeth I granted Trinity House the power to build beacons, marks and signs for the sea. In other words, that gave Trinity House its power, which it still holds today, to regulate lighthouses and buoys around the United Kingdom. In 1594, they were given the right to supply ballast, which of course is the material to make ships more stable within the Thames, which became a massive source of funding for their charities for retired seafarers. Moving ahead to 1609, Trinity House built its first lighthouse at Lowestoft. And for however years they competed with private lighthouse owners who operated for profit until an act in 1836 gave Trinity House the power to buy out all private lighthouses in England and Wales and continue with their duties under the Sea Marks Act to provide not just buoys and marks around the United Kingdom, but to provide lighthouses as well. Some quite famous people have been have led Trinity House during the past, often from the royal family or highest levels of government. Examples are Samuel Pepys. He served as a master twice in the 1600s. The Duke of Wellington served as master for 15 years between 1837 and 1852. And of course, the Princess Royal, Princess Anne, is the current master of Trinity House, having taken over the role from her father, Prince Philip, in 2011. The modern Trinity House is the General Lighthouse Authority for England, Wales, Channel Islands and Gibraltar, and its modern functions include the safety of navigation, maintaining these lighthouses, pilotage. They still license deep-sea pilots, although, as I explained earlier on, the 1987 Pilotage Act put the responsibility for local port pilotage into the hands of local competent harbour authorities. Trinity House still run a charity which provides housing for retired mariners and funds cadet training for the Merchant Navy. And they are, of course, leaders in advice in technology, leading to the transition of e-navigation using GPS, ECDIS and future charts. So Trinity House themselves are a very, very broad organisation. But let's go back to our COLREGs. In 1840, Trinity House drafted the first set of formal rules with regards to what they called the rule of the road. And this started to talk about giving way to vessels on a particular side. So there were two initial rules that were in the rule of the road which talked about steam navigation. One was the head-on situation. So basically it said when steamships are heading together on reciprocal courses, they shall both alter course to starboard and pass on each other's port side. And the other one was the crossing regulation, which said that the vessel which had the other vessel on its own starboard side shall give way when two power-driven vessels were approaching one another so as to involve risk of collision. Now, they were very, very good rules, but we started to get a lot of doubt creeping in when those initial rule of the road were made because people didn't realise what side of the ship they were on. That might seem silly today because silhouettes and aspects of ships can appear quite obvious. But if you think about it, back there in the 1800s when new technology was being developed and new ships were being built, people were seeing certain designs of steamships for the first time and working out which way those steamships were going, whether they were looking at the port side or the starboard side, became increasingly difficult. So the British Admiralty at the end of the day took on board the Trinity House rule of the road and built them into the British Steam Navigation Act of 1846. Now, this Steam Navigation Act basically took into account everything that Trinity House had recommended and set out in 1840, put it into UK law, but very, very quickly realised a problem with recognising what side of the ship you were looking at. So in 1848, the British Admiralty mandated that steamships carried coloured side lights, red for port and green for starboard, so that in order to implement Trinity House's rule of the road, which was now an Act of Parliament, you could easily tell what side of one ship you were on. In 1863, the two great adversaries, the UK and France, jointly developed a comprehensive set of rules, and these were so effective that eventually they were adopted by over 30 other maritime nations, making for the first truly international effort to develop a set of rules to prevent collisions at sea. The UK rules that were created in those early days formed the foundation of these international rules, and because they were drafted so well, the international community started to recognise them as being very, very effective. And at the end of the day, that's what started the spread, if you like, of the use of these rules, was because they were seen by other countries as really going quite far in preventing collisions at sea, and not just another way of perhaps marking the territory of a government's power over shipping in its area. In 1889, 27 nations met in Washington, D.C., and their brief was to standardise global rules on risk of collision. And one of the key outcomes from that 1889 conference was that they established stand-on and give-way vessels, a principle which today forms the basis of a lot of the collision regulations. And also we have to take into account that some of the recent collisions we've had have happened because vessels have not acted properly as the give way or acted properly as the stand-on vessel. And again, I refer you to that Verity and Polsey collision, when neither the stand-on or the give way vessel did what the rule of the road requires them to do. There are other safety improvements that came out of the Washington Conference. One was the use of whistles in restricted visibility and to indicate alterations of course and operating a stern propulsion. The other one was the introduction of the second masthead light in order to indicate what in those days were considered to be huge vessels. When you look at the COLREGs now, you see that it's vessels over 50 metres that are required to carry this second masthead light. So it just shows you how the size of vessels has increased over time, that a vessel over 50 metres 150 years ago was considered to be a huge vessel. Obviously, after the Second World War, we had the IMO formed, which was initially called IMCO, the International Maritime Government Cooperation organisation, and then was changed to the IMO in the 90s. They were created after the Second World War as a branch of the United Nations to start to bring together national and international regulations and ensure that those conventions were adopted internationally. Now, one of the first remits of the newly formed IMCO was to develop the SOLAS Convention, the Safety of Life at Sea Convention. And in 1960, SOLAS recognised that another tool had come into our arsenal to be able to prevent collisions, and that was, of course, radar. Radar was developed very, very highly during the Second World War as a means of fighting And it was only after that Second World War that radar was made available to non-warships as a means of, 1, detecting other targets, 2, determining whether risk of collision exists, and 3, used for navigation and the ability to range off of the land and prominent objects. So recommendations were injected into the now international SOLAS conference on avoiding collisions, but the radar stuff were all recommendations. They were not considered to be standards, and it wasn't until the modern era of our current COLREGs came into force in 1972 did we have a adopted international regulations for preventing collisions at sea. And it was landmark because it was a standalone treaty under the then IMCO. And in 1972, everything that had been proposed by the numerous countries over the past 150 years were adopted into a single internationally accepted document, which meant that finally some of these excellent rules that had been made over hundreds of years were known by all and implemented on a global basis. The 1972 COLREGs were important not just because they were the first fully international convention to deal with collision regulations, but they introduced a lot of new stuff into the collision regulations themselves. The 72 COLREGs were designed to be a living document that was never seen as a final work of art. And at the end of the day, there were major amendments made in 1981, 1987, when I was a cadet. That was a big one. We'll talk about that in a minute. 1989, 93, 2001 and 2007 to keep up with things such as high-speed craft, environmental protection to make sure that there were no conflicts going on, and impeding, which remains today one of the most adaptable, shall we say, rule within the collision regulations. What I mean by adaptable is that impeding has gone through lots and lots of different transitions before it got to its original meaning that we have now in the modern collision regulations. At the end of the day, COLREG 72 wasn't just a minor update, it was a total overhaul of maritime law. And although it took a lot of the basics, particularly from those original Trinity House rules of the road from way back in 1840, it started to give us a very, very precise way of avoiding collision, which addressed many, if not all, of the potential situations that could be created when two vessels are approaching one another, particularly when a risk of collision exists. At the end of the day, what we were doing in 1972 was shifting from basically what was a set of rules that countries perhaps chose whether or not to adopt. And as I've said before, a lot of them chose to adopt it because the UK draft in particular was so effective. But it shifted the rules to a treaty. At the end of the day, COLREG 72 is a convention that basically introduced what we know as tacit acceptance. Tacit acceptance basically means that if a certain number of countries become signatories to that convention, then that convention becomes enforceable on an international basis. And everyone who has effectively signed up to it has an obligation to write it into their own national legislation. Indeed, some of the latest changes to the COLREGs that have come out are changes that were brought about by what we call the III Code, the implementation of international instruments. This is a code that basically allows the IMO to audit flag states to ensure that the laws written by that flag state are suitable and uphold international standards that have been decided. The COLREGs themselves are an international standard. They are a convention, and therefore those members of the IMO that have signed up to that convention must use appropriate national legislation to enforce that convention upon their ships. The III Code ensures that that legislation is sufficient and up to date. And the latest rules to be added to the collision regulations are rules that ensure that this is the case. Another big change in 72 was the formalisation of traffic separation schemes that were introduced in the busiest shipping lanes in the world to try and segregate traffic. It mandated that ships followed those designated traffic lanes and that they followed the general direction of traffic for those lanes. And it dramatically reduced head-on collisions in the world's busiest waterways. The Dover Straits, the Singapore Straits are just two examples of areas where collisions were rife due to literally the huge amount of shipping that used it. Although radar was adopted in the 1960s as recommendations, radar-assisted collisions started to become common, and another way the 1972 COLREGs addressed this was to try and reduce the number of radar-assisted collisions by bringing out regulations that said that all means must be used to keep a lookout and determining risk of collision, not just the radar. And Rule 7, and those of you that have done a COC will remember it, assumptions cannot be based on scanty information, in particular scanty radar information. And therefore the limitations of radar were already being picked up by the international community and legislated for within those 72 COLREGs. At the end of the day, the 72 COLREGs also moved away from the simple steam versus steam or steam versus sail hierarchy and introduced the concept of responsibilities between vessels, allowing vessels that were of a certain description to show certain signals and power-driven vessels to give them right of way. Not under command, restricted an ability to manoeuvre, fishing vessels, sailing vessels, and vessels eventually that were constrained by their draft all became a certain type of vessel within the definitions of the collision regulations, and power-driven vessels in particular had an obligation to keep out of the way of a lot of those vessels. The technical language of the collision regulations changed in 72 as well. Things like put a light on the mast were replaced by a masthead light definition of a light that shone a certain colour over a certain arc of the horizon. And this allowed us to differentiate between those lights that were used to determine power-driven vessels, to determine the length of vessels, and to determine the side of the vessels. The 72 rules closed the stand-on loophole, which basically said to the stand-on vessel before the 72 COLREG said if one vessel was to keep out of the way, the other shall maintain its course and speed, end of. The 1972 fix clarified that that stand-on vessel may take action as soon as it became apparent that the other vessel was not, and must take action when collision cannot be avoided by the vessel that was meant to give way. So that was another huge change that 72 brought about. 72, though, didn't fix everything. 72 didn't fix the problem of dealing with huge vessels. The 72 regulations basically shoved a 20-foot motorboat in the same bracket as a 100,000 ton tanker, and quite obviously, particularly now that ships are huge, 400 metres long, 62 metres wide, it's foolish to think that a vessel of that size navigating in an area where deviating from its course may put it into danger should behave the same way as a small 20-foot pleasure boat who's more than capable of manoeuvring quickly and efficiently. And so we started to have this problem of this mix match creep in, and this was fixed by the impeding regulation that came out. Now, this is the regulation that came out when I was a cadet in 1987. I remember going to sea and coming back from sea, and all the lecturers at South Tyneside College saying to us, "Wow, you guys, we've just had a change to the collision regulations which is absolutely huge." we've got this new Rule 8F and you guys need to get to grips with it. And it was a massive thing in 1987 that at the end of the day, we now had not just a give-way and a stand-on vessel, we now had vessels that were required not to impede the passage of other vessels. So we now had a rule that applied regardless of whether there was risk of collision or not, and a rule that applied regardless of the relationship between the two vessels. What do I mean by that? Well, for instance, fishing vessels were required not to impede the passage of any vessel following a narrow channel. Now that meant that if that vessel following a narrow channel was a power-driven vessel and would normally be keeping out of the way and giving way to that fishing vessel, that fishing vessel had an obligation not to impede that power-driven vessel within the narrow channel. In other words, if the two vessels were approaching one another, the fishing vessel must take action even before a risk of collision was allowed to develop, so that the huge ship within the narrow channel wasn't forced to take action under the responsibilities rule. Rule 8F does go on to say that the vessel, the passage of which is not to be impeded, remains fully obliged to comply with the rule. So ultimately, if that fishing vessel were to impede, then the power-driven vessel would remain the give-way vessel. But we're starting to get in a little bit to the technical nitty-gritty of the rules and away from this introduction, if you like, to how these rules developed. So even before two vessels decided that a risk of collision existed, one vessel may have an obligation under Rule 9, narrow channels, Rule 10, traffic separation schemes, or Rule 18, vessels constrained by the draft, may have had an obligation to take early action to allow sufficient sea room for the other vessel to pass, so that that other vessel didn't even have to consider taking action under any of the regular rules. That came in 1987, and at the end of the day, that was one of the biggest changes to the COLREGs. Since then, changes have been pretty much minor. We've had additions to the list of distress signals given in Annex 4. We've had a change to some of the lights that are shown by introducing some new classes of vessels, such as high-speed vessels, non-displacement craft, seaplanes. But to all intents and purposes, the version that we are looking at today, the 2026 collision regulation version, although it doesn't have any new steering and sailing rules in it and came into force in January this year, has just some technical specification changes regarding things like LED lights, which are perhaps the change that most people would be interested in, as a lot of navigation lights, particularly on smaller vessels, are now driven by LEDs. That change is all that there is. The 2026 regulations were not a massive change in any of the steering and sailing rules. They were there simply, or the change was there simply to address some of the technical details at lights. But we do have a 2026 version of the collision regulations, and it was the appearance of that 2026 version and the number of MAIB reports that seem to be coming out at the moment about the COLREGs that prompted me into discussing the development of the collision regulations over the years and how they went from being custom and practice of keeping away from another sailing vessel all the way through to those Trinity House rules of the road in 1840 that were finalised by introducing side lights, masthead lights and whistle signals, all the way through to the adoption of radar in the 60s and through to the 1972, which, by the way, is the current convention that we work to. We may have a 2026 version of the collision regulations themselves, but the convention is still the 1972 convention that brought the COLREGs bang up to date by introducing the rules necessary to avoid collision and some technical details on what we should and indeed should not display as a certain type of vessel. I hope you found this podcast interesting. Bit of a history lesson really about the collision regulations, but hopefully you're a little bit more learned now about how these regulations came about. Before we depart from this podcast, though, I do want to mention something that I feel is being lost a little bit at the moment, and that is the requirements of Rule 2, which is titled Responsibilities in the 1972 text, was part of the original 1972 text, and really this is a message to everybody out there that is charged with making decisions under the collision regulations. The collision regulations are not just text. The collision regulations are far more than that. The collision regulations are an extremely clever way of avoiding collisions. When you look into the technicalities of the actions that are required both by the stand-on and the give-way vessels within these regulations, they are very, very clever. But none of these regulations will work unless we apply seamanship to those regulations. Rule 2 says precautions which may be required by the ordinary practice of seamen or by the special circumstances of the case. That means that as we apply these collision regulations, simply applying the text is not good enough, because nothing in the text of these regulations is going to protect you if you have a collision. Trinity House, the experts at Trinity House, the navigation assessors at Trinity House, Admiralty judges are not just going to be looking at whether or not a ship complied with the words of the collision regulations. They will be looking at whether the officer of the watch or master of each one of the ships involved demonstrated the ordinary practice of seamen and applied good seamanship to these collision regulations. So next time you're thinking to yourself, how far should I alter course for that fishing vessel in order to give way to it, apply a bit of seamanship to it. I'm not just going to come a little way round that fishing vessel. I'm going to give a nice big alteration of course, show everybody what I'm doing, make it obvious to that fishing vessel that I'm giving way to it. I'm going to do something with my ship that sends a seaman-like signal out to everybody around it that I am complying with the rules and that I, at the end of the day, are doing something that is obvious and seaman-like. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening to this podcast. It was great to have you all on board. I look forward to welcoming you back to the next Maritime Education podcast. But in the meantime, guys, please push the subscribe button and have a great day.